Video games are a hot-button topic today, and not only among players. Multiple disciplines such as education, psychology, and even instances of the hard sciences are studying or using games in their research. Video games are now considered to be cultural items. As such, there are emerging efforts to preserve them in an archival fashion. This poses many interesting challenges, but none so important as context. A video game, broken down into its most base form, is binary code. If this is all that needed to be archived, there wouldn't be much of an issue. I will cover that in a little bit. However, games consist of many more components than code. These components make up the context of the game. I argue that there are three major categories of context relating to video games: hardware and software, development, and player interaction. Even with these three broad categories, the overlap is undeniable. I will do my best to explain and provide examples for each. I feel it is necessary to discuss the archival theory of context in order to apply it to video games. An object or document can be nearly useless without preserving the context surrounding it. To rephrase O'Toole and Cox, the archivist learns to see through the items to larger insights that ultimately help explain the items, the actions that produced them, and the information they contain. Context also applies to the archival value of uniqueness, on which O'Toole and Cox state, archival records are to be preserved as completely and coherently as possible, with critical information about content and connections preserved. Context is a difficult concept for all aspects of archival work. The balance lies in what and how much to save to create the best possible record for the future. The first category of context I'd like to discuss is that of hardware and software. As I stated previously, a video game in its most base form is code. Hardware and software begin to play a role almost immediately, especially regarding the question of accessibility. How will the game be played? What sort of equipment will be needed? What programs will read the code and render it? These are practical applications of context. There are more subtle ones as well, namely that of intended use. Is the game true to the original creation? I stated earlier that code can be easy to deal with. It's just a matter of migrating it from one form to another, called emulation. However, the original context of a game is lost. Part of the challenge of classic games was battling with a cartridge and distinctly non-sensitive controls. Updated versions erase these original features in favor of a more streamlined experience. Emulation solves the problems of games disappearing entirely, but at the cost of experiencing the original. As Megan Wingett, a pioneering video game scholar, states, games are complex socio-technological objects that depend on user interaction to obtain meaning. Meaning changes substantially when the medium on which the game is playing changes. Practical considerations come into play as well. Hardware is difficult to maintain over time. Emulators are possibly the only answer to this conundrum. A video game does not come fully formed onto a store shelf. It is representative of thousands of hours of work behind the scenes. This development process can be further split into two categories, commercial and artistic. One cannot exist without the other. Commercial aspects of development may include funding, advertising, and other business-type ventures. Artistic aspects include art direction, storyline, character development, and much more. As O'Toole and Cox state, it is important to develop structural understanding of these phenomena, looking on them not as random productions of human interest, but rather the result of deliberate, often complicated, processes that must be reconstructed and understood. Ultimately, companies are going to try to make money off of the games their studio creates. The studios, while bound by commercial demands, see the game as an art form, as a means of expression and storytelling. The documentation surrounding these aspects shows that. In this case, documentation may be emails, artwork, and meeting agendas. These resources are valuable for a multitude of future researchers, including game companies themselves. A prime example of saving developmental-related context is that of Space Invaders. Its creator, Tomohiro Nishikado, created the hardware and software from scratch. However, the game still performed too slowly for his liking, but he had stretched the very limits of what computers were capable of at the time. Much to his surprise, as the player defeated an invader, they sped up. This was not intentional. It turns out that as the invaders were defeated from the screen, the computer no longer had to render them, freeing up CPU usage. Tomohiro Nishikado had accidentally created the difficulty curve, which has been used in some form in all games ever since. The point remains, without documentation, this bit of gaming history and an important piece of game theory would be lost. Even with thousands of hours of development, a game may fall flat once players get their hands on it. Without players, the game is meaningless. It exists, sure, but has no purpose. Players determine the importance of the game. A AAA blockbuster may not get much attention, while an indie game gets showered with praise. It's all in how the players interact with the game. Another important facet of player interaction is the creation of mods. Mods are user-created content that is added to the game post-release. These mods can shape the game or the franchise for the future and occasionally spawns new games entirely. Overall, player interaction and ingenuity promote growth and development in the gaming industry. It effectively creates a feedback loop, the overall goal being to create the next best game. Some argue that fanfiction and fan art should be added to archival collections. While these are technically interactions by players, it does not relate directly to the game itself. Again, these elements have spawned interesting contributions to games in the past, but the main issue of context rears its ugly head at this point. Where does the context end? This comes back to the theories relating to scope. Video game collections, as with any collections, have to have a fairly good idea of scope. Otherwise, the archivist will fall into the trap of saving everything, which is just not feasible. A fantastic example of player ingenuity impacting the gaming industry is the origin of Counter-Strike. In 1998, the game Half-Life was released by Valve. Not long after, in 1999, a user-created mod for Half-Life emerged, known as Counter-Strike. The mod was incredibly popular, and Valve took notice. They brought the creators of the mod onto their team, where they were told to create an entire independent game from the mod. Counter-Strike became the property of Valve and was released to smashing success, and has been a staple of the first-person shooter genre ever since. The major challenge facing video game archiving is metadata. This is the most argued issue in the literature today. However, it is also important to consider when trying to link context as well. Most metadata attempts today originate from the video game companies themselves, especially when considering genre and contributors. The Library of Congress, who began preserving games this decade, include only 7 metadata fields. Jin Ha Lee, another pioneering scholar in the video game archival field, has come up with no less than 25 possible metadata fields, with arguments for more. She draws parallels to film archiving and the issues it faces. She also notes that metadata can be extremely subjective. There are discrepancies of definition and of perceptions at almost every turn. Metadata is a major issue facing video game archiving, and therefore context. Context is important in all archival ventures. This is a value that has been held by archivists for ages. This is also true when archiving video games. Unfortunately, the focus of video game archiving is currently on immediate problems, such as preservation and metadata. As archivists focus on these issues, context continues to slip by, lost to time. It is not enough to preserve just the base code of a game. As Wingett states, games are social artifacts and require explicit descriptions of their use and interaction states. Even though there are challenges inherent in linking games in context, doing so provides a richer experience for researchers and future players.